I was standing in line at a small bakery in Amsterdam when the American guy behind me leaned forward and said, "Man, I gotta ask, how do people here afford to live?" He wasn't whispering. He said it with that friendly, concerned tone, like he was asking how we survive winters without electricity. I laughed and said, "Afford what exactly?" He gestured vaguely at everything. The bread, the street, the buildings. "I mean, this is Europe. It's gotta be tough, right?" The woman behind the counter paused mid-slicing and looked at him the way you look at someone who just asked if fish can drown. He doubled down. "Back home, rent like this would destroy you. I just hope you guys are doing okay." She smiled politely and said, "I own this shop." He blinked. I could see the gears trying to recalculate. "So, you inherited it?" he asked. She shrugged. "No, I bought it 10 years ago." Silence. Actual, physical silence. Even the espresso machine felt awkward. He tried one last rescue. "But healthcare must be rough." She laughed. "I had surgery last year. Paid nothing." He nodded slowly, like someone hearing a ghost story he didn't want to believe. When he finally left, he leaned toward me and whispered, "Man, they don't look poor." And that was the moment it clicked. Americans don't think Europe is struggling because of facts. They think it's struggling because the math they were taught doesn't work here. And once you notice that, you start seeing it everywhere. That quiet confusion, that polite smile hiding panic, is where every one of these stories begins. And trust me, this bakery moment was gentle. Because once Americans travel more, the assumptions get louder, stranger, and a lot harder to ignore. This was only the beginning. After that bakery moment, I started noticing the pattern everywhere. Not once or twice, but constantly. Trains, bars, hotel breakfasts, random Uber rides. Americans would lower their voice and say things like, "So, is it hard living here?" As if Europe were a mildly embarrassing financial condition. In Paris, a guy sipping a €5 espresso told a waiter, "You know, back home, this lifestyle would be impossible." The waiter smiled and said, "Yes, that is why I am here and not there." The American laughed, then paused, unsure if that was a joke or a warning. I'm not guessing here. I've lived in Europe, worked in Europe, dated Europeans, paid taxes in Europe. I've watched Americans arrive confident, curious, and well-meaning, only to slowly realize their internal calculator is broken. They keep doing conversions that don't apply. Dollars to euros, rent to salary, cost to worth, none of it lands. At a hostel in Lisbon, a woman told me, "I just feel bad for people here. They seem happy, but..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. A Portuguese guy nearby looked up from his beer and said, "But what?" She smiled. "Nothing, just different." He nodded and said, "Yes, we are differently not stressed." That's when I realized this isn't about ignorance. It's about training. Americans are taught one equation: more money equals better life. Europe teaches a messier formula involving time, safety, and not losing your mind at 40. When Americans see smaller cars, smaller homes, or fewer brand names, their brain fills in the gap with the word poor. And the wild part is Europeans rarely correct them. Not aggressively, not defensively. They just let Americans talk. They let them explain. They let them pity. Sometimes they even thank them for the concern. Because watching someone confidently misunderstand your entire system is oddly entertaining. I've seen it enough times that I can predict the beats. First curiosity, then concern, then quiet superiority. Someone will say, "Well, at least in the U," and trail off, expecting agreement. Instead, they get silence, or a soft smile, or someone casually mentioning 6 weeks of vacation. That's when Americans stop talking and start recalculating, because their mental spreadsheet has no column for peace. And once that recalculation starts, the trip changes. They don't say it out loud yet, but the doubt is there. And soon, it demands answers. Those answers arrive fast, loud, and hilariously wrong. Next. The mild cases always start politely, almost sweet. like a concerned uncle who means well but has no idea what your job actually is. The first time I heard it was in Rome, sitting at a tiny outdoor table when an American couple leaned over and asked, "So, do people here need roommates forever?" I said, "Some do, some don't." The husband nodded gravely. "Yeah, housing must be brutal." The waiter set down our food and said, "I live alone." The wife smiled sympathetically. "Oh, downtown?" He said, "No, here." She paused. "Like, near your job?" He laughed. "This is my job." They both stared at the plate like the pasta might explain it. Later, the husband whispered, "Man, he seems happy for someone barely scraping by." I realized scraping meant something very specific in his head. In Berlin, a woman at a cafe told me, "I just hope people here aren't overworked." I asked why. She gestured at a man reading a book. "He's been here for hours." The man looked up and said, "It's Sunday." She frowned. "Yeah, but don't you have stuff to do?" He smiled. "This is the stuff." She laughed politely, then leaned toward me. "I mean, it's cute, but eventually real life hits, right?" He closed his book and said, "It already did. That's why I'm sitting." She nodded like he'd said something inspirational instead of factual. Then there was Barcelona. An American guy in our group said, "I love the vibe here, but I'd get anxious without Amazon Prime." A local woman raised an eyebrow. "Why?" He said, "What if you need something fast?" She shrugged. "Then I walk." He laughed. "Yeah, but emergencies." She thought for a second. "Like bread?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then said, "No, like stuff." She nodded slowly, the way you do when someone says a word but can't define it. Afterward, he told me, "They don't even realize what they're missing." I looked around at the sun, the food, the street musicians, and wondered what exactly he thought they lacked. The softest one was in Copenhagen. An American woman sighed and said, "I wish we could stay longer, but I'd feel guilty enjoying this when people here probably struggle." A Danish guy overheard and said, "Struggle with what?" She said, "Money." He laughed, not cruelly, just surprised. "No, we struggle with winter." She smiled. "That too." He said, "But we plan for it." That sentence landed wrong. Planning wasn't part of her equation. Each time, the pattern was identical. Americans weren't mocking. They weren't bragging. They were genuinely worried. But their worry came from a single assumption. If life looks simpler, it must be poorer. Smaller spaces, fewer brands, less noise. They saw absence where there was choice. Europeans heard concern and translated it as confusion. Nobody argued, nobody corrected. The misunderstanding just floated there, awkward and polite, and those were the gentle moments, the ones where everyone laughed and moved on. Because once Americans got comfortable, once the conversation stretched past coffee and into dinner, the assumptions stopped whispering. They started speaking clearly, confidently, and very loudly. When the assumptions escalated, they stopped sounding polite and started sounding instructional. In Prague, an American guy at dinner leaned back, fork in hand, and said, "You guys are lucky, honestly. If this were America, you'd be struggling." The Czech woman across from him asked, "Struggling with what?" He said, "Everything, rent, healthcare, life." She nodded and said, "I pay my rent. I went to the doctor today. I am eating steak." He laughed nervously. "Yeah, but like long term." She tilted her head. "I am 45. The table went quiet. Afterward, he told me, "She doesn't get how close she is to the edge." I didn't know how to explain that the edge he feared didn't exist here. In Amsterdam, a woman touring apartments shook her head and said, "I just couldn't live this small." A Dutch guy said, "Why?" She said, "Where would all my stuff go?" He asked, "What stuff?" She started listing appliances, seasonal decor, storage bins. He waited, then said, "We do not buy our identity." She laughed, assuming it was a joke. He wasn't joking. Later, she whispered, "He's judging Americans." He wasn't. He was confused why possessions were emotional support. Things got louder in Florence. An American man announced, "Europeans don't think big." A waiter paused and said, "Big like what?" The man spread his arms. "Big houses. Big dreams." The waiter smiled. "I dream of sleeping." The American chuckled, then said, "No, I mean success." The waiter nodded. "Yes, that is success." The American stared like he'd been handed a puzzle with missing pieces. The most awkward was in Vienna. A woman said, "At least in the US, hon, if you work hard, you can be rich." An Austrian man replied, "Here, if you work normal, you can be calm." She said, "But what if you want more?" He asked, "More what?" She said, "Money." He thought, then said, "Why?" She laughed too fast. Nobody answered. The conversation drifted, but the tension stayed. By this point, I could feel Americans panicking, not outwardly, internally. Their worldview was built on effort equals reward. Europe kept offering a different equation, and every time Americans tried to fix it, locals responded with gentle disbelief. The louder the assumption, the quieter the response. And that silence was doing damage. Because once Americans start realizing money isn't the universal translator, they don't argue. They start asking dangerous questions, questions they are not ready for. They pushed harder in Munich. An American engineer explained salaries on his phone and said, "See, this is why people leave." A German woman leaned over and said, "Leave to where?" He said, "Somewhere with opportunity." She replied, "My opportunity is leaving work at 4. He laughed. "No, I mean real growth." She said, "I grow tomatoes." He blinked. The table laughed, not at him, but at the collision. Later he admitted, "I thought I was motivating her." He was exporting anxiety. In Madrid, an American couple whispered, "How do locals survive without tipping?" A bartender heard and said, "We are paid." The man frowned. "But don't you want extra?" The bartender shrugged. "I want to go home." The wife said, "That's sad." He smiled. "No, that is tonight." When they left, the husband said, "They lack ambition." The bartender locked up early and met friends. By now, the joke wasn't that Americans thought Europe was poor. It was that they thought concern sounded generous. Each explanation came with charts, examples, reassurance. Locals responded with questions Americans couldn't answer without sounding ridiculous. What is success? How much is enough? Why is busy impressive? The conversation stalled not because Europeans lacked answers, but because Americans lacked definitions. I watched confidence drain slowly. Jokes landed softer. Bragging stopped working. Someone would say, "Back home and trail off, realizing home wasn't winning this comparison. The funniest part was how quiet it got. No debates, no fights, just long pauses and sips of wine. That's when the escalation really began. Because once Americans stop explaining and start listening, the realization hits harder. The system they believed was universal turns out to be optional. And when that thought settles in, it doesn't end the conversation. It detonates the next one. One night in Zurich sealed it. An American consultant pulled me aside and said, "I feel like I'm missing something." I asked what. He said, "They're not impressed." He listed his job title, his hours, his stress. A Swiss man nearby overheard and said, "Impressed is for performances." The consultant asked, "Then what matters?" The man said, "Tomorrow." Silence again. Walking back, the consultant muttered, "If this works, why doesn't everyone do it?" I didn't answer, because the question wasn't about Europe anymore. It was about America. And once that flips, the stories stop being funny and start being dangerous. That shift scared them. You could see it in their eyes. Curiosity turning into doubt. Pride turning into math. They didn't lose arguments. They lost certainty. And certainty, once cracked, doesn't politely repair itself. It spreads. It asks follow-up questions. It notices patterns. By the time dinner ended, nobody wanted dessert. They wanted explanations. And explanations were coming next. Those explanations wouldn't comfort them. They would dismantle assumptions piece by piece, slowly, calmly, until confidence collapsed under its own weight, without shouting, without anger, and without anyone noticing exactly when it happened. And that was coming very soon. The moment you start noticing Americans assuming Europe is poor, you realize it isn't random. It's systematic. It's not just one confused tourist or one overly confident businessman. It's a mindset cultivated over decades of cultural and economic conditioning. Americans are trained to equate success with numbers, salaries, square footage, possessions. The louder the paycheck, the safer the life, the bigger the house, the happier the person. Europe doesn't operate on that equation. Not at all. Take healthcare, for example. In the US, medical bills are omnipresent, looming over every decision. Americans internalize the fear. When they see a European casually walking out of a clinic, paying nothing, Americans' brains scramble. How can this be possible? They ask internally. Europeans shrug. It's just the system. Nothing heroic, nothing dramatic. The gap between expectation and reality is what fuels the comedy, the polite disbelief, the eyebrow raises. Education works similarly. Americans measure opportunity by tuition costs, student debt, and prestige. Europeans measure opportunity by access, flexibility, and personal growth. An American says, "I'd kill to study there," and the European replies, "You can." The American pauses, then says, "Yeah, but cost?" The European nods slowly. We plan differently. That pause, that recalculation, is what I've seen over and over. Psychologically, the clash comes from differing worldviews about risk and reward. Americans are trained to see effort as linear. More work equals more gain. In Europe, effort is contextual. Efficiency, regulation, and social safety nets redistribute reward. What Americans interpret as lack of ambition is often Europeans maximizing life outside the paycheck. They work smart, live calmly, and occasionally take a 3-hour lunch without panic. Media and upbringing reinforce this. American children grow up on narratives glorifying hustle and consumption. European children grow up learning self-sufficiency, collective responsibility, and quality of life over quantity. When these models collide, Americans default to their map of the world. If it looks modest, it must be struggling. Meanwhile, Europeans see adults who are calm, self-assured, and laughing at assumptions. Even personality and social norms play a role. Americans tend to vocalize concern. Europeans tend to observe. Politeness and social restraint amplify the comedy. When an American declares, "You guys must be broke," the European doesn't argue. They smile, nod, or quietly correct. That silence speaks volumes louder than words. It forces Americans to recalibrate internally, often leading to embarrassment or awe. It's not arrogance and it's not ignorance, it's pattern recognition gone sideways. The American brain seeks familiar markers of status: a car, a big house, visible spending. Europe deliberately removes some of those markers. That absence triggers a misinterpretation. Comfort is assumed absent, even when it's abundant. So why does this happen over and over? Because Americans are translating life through a single metric that doesn't exist abroad. Salaries, possessions, and visible consumption are universal only in theory. Culture, regulation, and lifestyle philosophies redefine wealth elsewhere. And Americans, trying to apply a universal formula to a system that rejects it, end up producing predictable, hilarious, and sometimes painfully insightful reactions. The fascinating part is that this isn't insulting. It's revealing. It exposes not European deficiency, but American assumptions. Every polite blink, every confused smile, every subtle eye roll from a local reflects a deeper cognitive mismatch. And as Americans start noticing patterns, that mismatch expands. It moves from minor confusion to internalized doubt, curiosity turning into existential questioning, pride morphing into self-scrutiny. By the end, it's no longer a funny quip at dinner. It's a profound confrontation between two mental models. Americans are left questioning what success truly means, and Europeans are left watching quietly, sometimes smiling, sometimes laughing, always bemused. And that, more than any anecdote, explains why these encounters escalate, why they're endlessly entertaining, and why the stories only get better as the assumptions get louder. The peak moments always hit when Americans start mixing confidence with concern, thinking they're being helpful, and Europeans start realizing they're being thoroughly misunderstood. One evening in Paris, an American consultant leaned across a cafe table and said, "You know, if you just moved to the US, you could double your income." A French woman blinked, fork in midair. "Double my income?" she asked. He nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, with the same effort, same hours." She set down her croissant. "And the stress?" He waved it off. "Stress is temporary." She paused. "Stress is permanent. Income is irrelevant." He laughed nervously. I could see the gears turning. He thought he was offering insight. She thought he was missing the point entirely. Later, he admitted to me, "I feel like I failed at motivating her." I didn't correct him. Motivation wasn't the goal. Understanding was. In Florence, another peak moment arrived with a group dinner. An American couple kept explaining their freedom and opportunity model. "We just work hard and get ahead," he said. "Everything's possible." A waiter overheard, tilting his head. "Everything? Really? Even peace?" The couple laughed awkwardly, unsure how to respond. The waiter continued, calmly listing his vacation days, sick leave, and work-life balance perks. The American's eyes widened. "Wait, you get paid and take time off?" The waiter nodded. "Yes, and I'm still working." Silence fell across the table. I leaned back, trying not to laugh. The concept of abundant time as a life metric was breaking their internal spreadsheet in real time. Zurich produced a quieter, more introspective peak. An American tech worker told me, "I feel like I'm constantly missing something here." I asked what. He gestured vaguely at the city streets, the trams, the cafés, and finally at a small grocery store. "They don't seem worried about anything." I raised an eyebrow. "Well, they've planned, optimized, and budgeted for decades." He frowned. "I mean, I can plan too." I said, "But you're counting money. They're counting life." That distinction landed slowly, painfully. He stared at the cashier, watching her smile while efficiently bagging groceries. The realization hit like gravity. Abundance isn't always visible, and comfort isn't always purchased. In Vienna, a peak moment blended comedy with cognitive collapse. An American couple entered a wine shop and began comparing everything to US standards. "Wow, this is cheap. Must be low quality," he said. The shopkeeper laughed. "Cheap? You're paying for efficiency, not scarcity." The woman whispered to me, "They just don't understand." Meanwhile, he had grabbed a bottle and muttered, "I could buy 10 of these back home." The shopkeeper tilted his head. "Yes, but you would still be anxious, and they'd expire in a week." The internal collapse of expectation was audible in the Americans' silence. Barcelona offered the most socially explosive peak. Americans were discussing healthcare loudly in a plaza, gesturing dramatically. "You guys must have hidden fees," one said. A Spanish local overheard. "Hidden? No, transparent, free if needed." Another added, "We don't brag, we plan." The American nodded slowly, trying to reconcile politeness with disbelief. Finally, he blurted, "So, you aren't struggling?" The group collectively laughed gently. He stared, realizing every assumption he'd carried for decades was just a mental projection. Across all these peak moments, a pattern emerged. Americans arrived with pride, confident in their universal formula for life. Europeans listened, questioned gently, and demonstrated a completely different calculus for comfort, stress, and success. Each story ended not with confrontation, but with a silent, internal reckoning. The Americans' internal dialogue became louder than any verbal exchange, filled with uncertainty, self-reflection, and mild panic. And in every instance, the humor wasn't mean-spirited, it was unavoidable. When someone confidently explains a universal truth that isn't universal at all, comedy writes itself. By the time these peak moments conclude, Americans aren't just laughing, they're learning, recalculating, and quietly conceding. And just when you think the lesson has landed, the next question arises: how do you measure a good life if money isn't the answer? That cliffhanger is what keeps every conversation and every story spinning toward the next level of absurdity. Looking back on all these encounters, the pattern becomes crystal clear. Americans arrive with a simple formula: work hard, earn more, consume more, and life equals success. Europe laughs quietly, not at them, but at the assumption itself. Houses are smaller, cars are modest, brands are subtle, but the people are calm, secure, and remarkably unpanicked. What Americans interpret as lack is actually a different kind of abundance. The key takeaway isn't that one system is better than the other. It's that Americans are conditioned to evaluate life through a single lens, and that lens doesn't translate. Wealth, comfort, and happiness aren't universal equations. They're cultural constructs. Europeans measure life differently. Hours off work, time with family, healthcare security, easy mobility, and yes, even a 3-hour lunch. It's not flashy. It's sustainable, and it's profoundly effective. Empathy becomes the bridge. Americans often feel compelled to help or advise, but what's needed is observation. Let the system speak for itself. Listen, watch, internalize the differences without judgment. When you do, the humor lands naturally, the confusion fades, and the cultural learning is unavoidable. Ultimately, this pattern reflects more on perception than reality. Europeans rarely struggle with the day-to-day worries Americans assume they do. They've engineered systems that minimize stress and maximize life quality. Americans, in turn, learn that not all success is measured in dollars or possessions. Some of it is measured in calm, freedom, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that life can work even without constant hustle. And as the stories unfold, the laughter isn't just at Americans' assumptions. It's at the gentle collision between two worldviews. Every polite pause, every baffled smile, every recalculated thought highlights a universal truth. Comfort wears different clothes. Wealth isn't always visible. Success isn't always loud. And sometimes the most eye-opening lessons come from realizing you've been calculating life entirely wrong. By the end, the lesson is soft but profound. Americans don't fail because they're wrong. They fail because their framework is incomplete. Europeans aren't poor. They're rich in ways Americans weren't taught to count. And if you pay attention, you might just start noticing the wealth hidden in simplicity, the abundance buried in calm, and the joy that exists quietly when no one is tallying dollars. It's a gentle, empathetic reminder. Before you assume, before you worry, look around. You might just find that the world is richer than your spreadsheet ever imagined. So here we are, back at the start, where an American leans across a table and asks, "How do you even survive here?" Except now you've seen the full story. Europe isn't poor, it's just rich in ways Americans weren't taught to count. And that punchline isn't delivered with a mic drop. It's everywhere, in the streets, cafés, and quiet apartments where life runs on its own logic. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone confidently misjudging a culture? Or maybe you were that person once, thinking smaller spaces or fewer brand names meant hardship. Drop your stories in the comments. I promise, the more clueless the assumption, the funnier the lesson. And if you're still here laughing, reflecting, or quietly recalculating your own mental spreadsheet, hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more collisions of expectation versus reality coming your way. Every episode brings stories, insights, and a few jaw-dropping moments you won't see in a guidebook. Remember, the next time someone confidently explains how life must work, watch quietly, sip your coffee, and smile. Because sometimes the richest lessons come from the people who think they're helping, and the world quietly laughing at their assumptions. Europe isn't struggling. Americans aren't wrong. They're just translating through the wrong lens. And somewhere in between, there's a laugh, a pause, and maybe the start of a better understanding. Stick around for that. because it's way more fun than spreadsheets.